This session today is hosted by BehindLogin, and we've recently launched a chatbot experience benchmark report. So what we're going to be doing is exploring where the conversational experience is headed. We'll be exploring some exclusive behind the login experiences, giving some examples of some best-in-class user experiences, and we'll also be inviting you to discover a blueprint for what a winning chatbot looks like. Okay, so we're going to start off with a few introductions. It's going to be a practical discussion today. We're going to avoid any AI hype, and we're hoping that you'll leave with some really useful tips and learnings. Okay, so I'm Gemma from BehindLogin. I'm going to hand over to Ollie to do introductions. Ollie.
Thanks, Gemma. Yeah, I'm Ollie. I'm the CEO at BehindLogin. And yeah, I guess a very quick nod towards the business. So we're about 4 years old and specialize in competitor and market intelligence within financial services. Or the clues in the name, we get you behind the login of your competitors, where typically there's a paywall or an authentication wall. So using our research panel, which is a kind of global panel of 1 million plus consumers, we get this access to these real authentic user experiences. And Ben, who's joining us today, is from Life Moments, adding a lot of value through their proposition and added some great comments to the report. So Ben, do you want to say a little hello?
Yes, hi. So Ben Leonard. So I did 20 years in banking, but for the last 8 years, been running Life Moments. So we're a money coaching technology business. So I think sort of guided journeys that help people through their finances, plan goals, explore their future, etc. Tied to Life Moments, unsurprisingly. And what we're really doubling down on and why we're excited to be involved in this is the idea of customer trust and customer experience and how firms are really taking that to the next level in the world of AI. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Ben. Okay, great stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off just with a quick recap of the report and then we'll move into the conversation. So we're going to start talking you through the benchmark methodology and the approach that we took for this activity. So we started off by selecting app-based chatbots from 20 of the global leading banks. For this study, we recruited real customers of these banks. We use a global panel, and these were all existing users of each of the different providers. So it wasn't in an artificial setting at all. These were all genuine customers of the banks that we studied, all live conditions. We capture the research in screen sharing sessions and we document it all. We meticulously document it all within Figma flows, and then we run it through a number of different assessment criteria. And the assessment criteria that we explored within this piece of research was language and intent, interaction experience, whether the experience can build trust, the sort of guardrails it offers, the data use and the personalization, and also its ability to support with action and task completion. So you can see those down here on the scoreboard. We've got the 20 different providers listed along the top here. Now, this gives a very quick view in a nutshell of our overall reports and our overall scores from the research. So this is available in our Essentials and our Pro report, which I think a few people that are here today have downloaded. Now, what we found across the providers that we explored was a huge range of approaches, some real different experiences. So no wonder it's hard to know what to expect as a user, as a customer of these banking providers when their approaches differ so significantly. Now, we at BehindLogin, we thought it was time for a benchmark. We thought it was time to work out, what's the common ground, what are the expectations across these experiences. So what we've produced is this report and a blueprint for what good looks like. Now, what we can see in these benchmark results are a few standout performers. So Revolut was our overall winner for this report. You can see that it scored really highly across all of the criteria for a number of different reasons across language and intent, interaction experience, trust and guardrails especially. A little bit less so on action and task completion, but it certainly made up for it, more than made up for it in other areas. So we'll show you some examples of what they did well later on in this session. Bunq did very well in offering trust and reassurance. Monzo performed very well with interaction experience. Starling did very well with action and task completion, whilst Bank of America had some really impressive use of data and personalisation. It's lower in the scoreboard overall, you'll see, because it's scored a little bit lower in other factors. And again, that's something that we'll touch on later on, because some of these providers gave us quite inconsistent results. You'll find that they were very strong in one area and not so strong in another. So we'll come on to this one. Now, the approach that we've taken for this one is each of us has taken one of these different areas, which we're going to explore in a little bit more detail later on. But firstly, I'd love to get some overall reflections from this. So, Ollie, firstly, over to you. What would you say the biggest headline was from these results?
Thanks, Gemma. Yeah, I think it's actually interesting just to kind of take a step back and look at the providers on the list. So, there's some pretty global brands here, some of the biggest financial institutions in the world, from the fintechs, and in the UK we've got Starling and Monzo, and then obviously Revolut, the global player. But really, these are banks, these are financial institutions with deep pockets, and the reason we selected them is because there's a lot of hype. I think a lot of these providers are talking about the quality of their chatbot experiences. So that's why we selected them. There's an interesting company called Evident AI who have built a sort of AI index which looks at kind of AI maturity across the market based on, I guess, publicly facing signals. So we use that as well as kind of comms across the market to define who were the top 20 to select for this research. And yeah, I think there's a good mix across the market. Even the sort of lower kind of quartile of the pack is still doing some really interesting stuff. There is obviously a bit of a shift between those and what top performance looks like. I think it's just a really interesting signal. Perhaps the claims across the market and the actual execution that you see in the hands of consumers has a bit of a disparity there. Again, looking at the kind of top four players, Revolut, Bunq, Starling, and Monzo, they're all the kind of, I guess, fintechy providers compared to the others who are more kind of traditional banks, and which perhaps isn't uncommon to see that they're leading the pack in terms of digital experience. Typically they've got less legacy constraints that they need to deal with in terms of ability to innovate, and perhaps slightly bigger risk appetites in terms of kind of compliance and compliance constraints. So that all sort of materializes in typically better experiences that we see. So yeah, that kind of traditional shift between the fintechs and the traditional players, I think is an interesting thing to call out.
Interesting that you mentioned the AI claims there, Ollie. The difference between the AI narrative and the actual experience. Ben, what's your reflections on that gap?
Yeah, there's a lot of AI washing out there, but I think, to be nice to everybody on this list, I think we've been going on for a while that customer facing AI needs to be accelerated. And I think banking chatbots haven't exactly been anything that anyone's ever liked for the last 10, 15 years. So they're coming from a very difficult place. So I think the first thing is sort of to applaud that everyone that's done this, because there's a lot of firms that aren't on this name that haven't done it. So I think that's a key thing to say. I think I fully agree. There's been a lot of we're going to do something amazing, and it's almost tone deaf in terms of where the consumer's at, in terms of what they're seeing and using elsewhere. And I think that's a bit of a shame, if I'm honest, that they're being oversold on LinkedIn. And maybe that doesn't matter because that's not where consumers are, versus the reality. The thing I find most disappointing maybe is the sort of data use piece, because I think banks have a lot of data on us, and the lack of ambition as to how that can get used to drive personalization and engagement. I'd expected to see better scores here. But I think that's exactly why this report's really useful, because I think we've been needing something like this for a while, where we can start to compare. And my experience, I've been almost 30 years in financial services. People work on the basis of FOMO rather than features, and therefore, if they feel they're falling behind, they will invest. And the last thing I guess I'd say, and this we did an event at Fidelity, Oli, that you were at a while ago, and I remember one of the execs there saying sort of restricted scope is not a lack of ambition. And I think there's a bit of a let's boil the ocean with this stuff and then deliver something not great. And I think what would be great to be seeing is much narrower, more refined scopes done really, really well, rather than we can solve everything and then not doing very well on any of it. And that's what differentiates, for me at least, a banking chatbot versus a chat GPT. You go there for a specific thing. You don't go there to ask how you're going to cook your lunch. So just maybe, to sum up, better use of data, um, don't overhype it, and get a scope that's very specific that you can differentiate on. Let's not forget, Monzo, one of the first thing it did was the freeze credit card, and that's how it built a lot of plaudits. You can do that sort of stuff here, I think.
I think the other interesting point is that some of these providers have got, I guess, legacy chatbots that are built on kind of pretty basic rule-based systems and decision tree-based functions. So actually sort of unwinding that capability and then building kind of more mature LLM-based functions is no mean feat. And you don't want to take a feature away even if it's in its kind of infancy, but it's still serving and solving customer problems. So there's a whole tech strategy around that shift of experience, which perhaps some of the kind of more fintechy providers haven't got to worry about. So yeah.
I think they're still fairly young in their maturity also, aren't they? It reminds me of the early days of apps when we'd have the kitchen sink apps where you'd have scopes coming along and there was that scope indecision. And it was so hard to peel the scope back when, nothing was proven. There wasn't a core way of doing it and there wasn't a precedent set in the market. And I think that's the stage that we're at now. And I think very quickly in the next probably 18 months, we're going to see that narrowing down. Because I think you're right, Ben. There's so much that they can do, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they should be doing it all.
And the other thing I'd add, I think and you know this because this is your business model, it's very easy to look at your competitors and see what the dashboard looks like or what the toggle looks like. But like with personalization, it's very difficult to interrogate how well these sorts of services function. And we're moving from a world where you build something and ship it and it's been built to a world where the real value in stuff like this is the ongoing optimization, sort of test rigs that these firms are building to improve. So, and I think that's why it's very brave that you've done this because some of the firms will have moved on already. But I think we need to find a way of assessing and measuring these incremental improvements that undoubtedly will come across all of these firms.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point as well around people moving on. So Revolut had launched Air, but that wasn't kind of available to the mass consumer market. Similarly, Lloyd's had announced some AI functionality, and there's comms across the market where either certain subsectors of customers or certain features or functions have been built using kind of more mature LLM based chat experiences. But we focused on kind of what's broadly available to the market, and again, that's another dynamic that you need to consider as when comparing those provider claims to the actual execution in terms of how broadly they've actually been sort of shared with the market.
I think it's a really good point, Ollie. The conversation has changed dramatically. I think from a year ago, it was what LLM are you using? Now it's what's the UX and what jobs to be done are you delivering on? So the sort of the landscape is shifting as well in terms of what's important for these firms. And it is, that's why I sort of say I think you've got to congratulate everyone for actually doing something because it's easy to sort of sit back and just watch others fail while you wait and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even with Revolut not having the very latest version in this assessment being top of the table, obviously it's doing a lot right. Ollie, what was separating the ones at the top of the table from those in the mid-table and going down? Were there any overall learnings?
Mm. Well, I guess just the point towards Revolut is I'm a bit annoyed that they came top, to be honest, because it's just like the only thing that you see all over LinkedIn nowadays is fanboys and fangirls of Revolut and all the great stuff they're doing. And to give credence to them is an amazing proposition and product. And yeah, as you say, it's not even their kind of latest version, but yeah, I mean, as you can see, they're kind of I think the top four or the top three in particular are just doing like well across everything. So they're good, clear language and intent understanding, nice interaction experience, doing well at building trust, doing well at using data and giving people that task completion capability. They're doing everything pretty well, I think is a kind of key trend across the kind of top providers. I also think, I guess more broadly, action and task completion surprisingly performed particularly well. You can see the lowest score there, I think, is an 8 from NatWest. But actually, even though the kind of older versions of chatbots, which were perhaps more kind of rule-based systems with limited scope, they're all actually a kind of like signposters, FAQ bots, the sort of things that the reason that a user might come to an app, think about the job to be done, is I can't complete that job within the traditional user experience. I can't find that feature in the interface, whatever it is. So therefore, I revert to the chat experience, and it's one layer away from calling the kind of contact center of the help desk, where we know you might have to wait on hold, and that's a kind of operational cost for organization. So having that interim step within the experience to facilitate that kind of helping a customer out when they can't find something is a good thing to do. And just having those pointers to say, okay, well, you want to do this thing. We know these are the common queries. We know these are where they exist within the experience where you can go and find that particular thing. I think that's a good example of where even the most basic chatbots are doing pretty well is across the action and task completion. But a lot of them are, even the best apps, there's 14s out of 20, they're still just signposting. There's no kind of, well, apart from freezing and unfreezing card, which randomly seems to be a pretty popular one that you can do across any apps where you can complete a task. But beyond that, they're all just signposting providers. So I think it'll be interesting to see that kind of top, the 6 points that are missing off the top will be enabling customers to actually complete things within the experience, which has obviously got its own hurdles attached to it and challenges. But I think that will be the kind of next tier of quality that we see as the market evolves.
Okay, so before we move on to the assessment criteria, were there any other surprises that stood out? Anything else specific from this score table?
I'd come back, and I know we're going to touch on a bit, but again, this data use and personalization. If you look at what things like Air are doing, and I think Clio's got it in there, I know it's not in the report, but we're moving to a world where these conversational assistants become sort of always on financial planning tools, which are going to require a big step up in the way in which consented data is used. And I think it would be, I mean, obviously things have moved on since you've done the report. This is going to be the one I see where there's going to be most momentum and competitive tension in the market because people are going to expect this. And if the alternative, I'll download my bank statement and upload it to ChatGPT, then I think it's the area where the banks have got the biggest opportunity as well, to really start to gain usage.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting point because we're suddenly seeing with open banking so many third-party providers that aren't necessarily banks using that same data for supporting services. We did a report earlier this year focusing on building societies, for instance, and some of their legacy systems we were hearing were up to 30 years old, 30, 50 years old in some cases. And actually, suddenly the world is moving forward that as soon as the data can be surfaced to a point where a third party can access it, the bank has a duty to start disrupting itself in that kind of way. So yeah, I think we're going to start to see some really intelligent solutions emerge. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to, sorry, Ollie, we're going to add another there.
No, I was just going to say, open banking it's an interesting one because it's sort of, I think as a proposition coming to market, it sounded brilliant. And there's some cool fintechs that have done well at kind of using the technology, but it hasn't really made the splash that I think the market expected. And then literally earlier this week, Plaid, kind of open banking provider, and OpenAI collaborated to deliver this kind of personalized financial advice. So you can get all your open banking data into OpenAI and it's sort of personalized financial advice. So the step beyond just downloading your statement and popping into ChatGPT, now there's real life examples of where you can, if you trust it, where you can start using some of these things in a more mature way. And I think, as the Ben said, that's the opportunity for banks. It's also a massive risk that if you don't own the data, you don't own the narrative around the customer experience, then you can very quickly become a MCP layer or just a data layer. And then who owns the experience is ultimately who's driving value for a lot of these customers.
Yes.
Open banking plus ChatGPT doesn't sound like it ends well, does it?
There'll be books written about this. If we're still reading books, hopefully we will be. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at each of the assessment criteria. We're going to focus in on a few of these. So, as we mentioned, the benchmark was a sum of these 5 different areas. Each of us here today, Ollie, Ben, and myself, each of us has chosen one of these areas to do a bit of a deep dive on. So, what we're going to do is we're going to give you some examples of what we see genuinely good experience and execution looking like. So I'm going to start. I'm going to give you a quick walk through the different areas, and I'm going to start with a focus on language and intent. So that's the one which Revolut came top for. Okay, so we've got language and intent, we've got data use and personalization, action and task completion, and interaction experience. So, okay, we're going to focus on language and intent to start with. So this is one of the best in class views that we've got within our report, where we do a bit of a focus on various screens and annotations to give examples of how the scoring was applied. Okay, so the reason that I selected this one is I really see language and intent being the new frontier for brand engagement. I see this as being a fantastic new space for brands to interact in a way that they haven't previously. Now, yes, chatbots have been around for absolutely years. I can remember, 5 years ago when these things were flying off the shelves and everyone suddenly wanted to have a chatbot for the next campaign. But actually, it's the use of the data, it's the fact that it's actually playing a key part in the service as an assistant. Suddenly, times are changing. Now, brand positioning and copy tone may be long established for all of these different providers, but for lots of consumers, this will be the first time ever that they've interacted and engaged with their financial provider in this kind of way. So conversational assistants are setting the new precedent, and it's no surprise that we're seeing lots of different approaches because lots of brands have different flavours. Some of them are taking more of a direct and transactional approach. Some of them are more relaxed and feel a little bit more human in their dialogue. So, of course, the tone is pretty subjective and brand specific, but neither is necessarily good or bad. So, what we didn't do in this report is score based on whether we think this sounds like a lovely conversation. What we scored it on is how genuinely useful it is. So it's not about brand style, it's about the ability to interpret intent. And that's what's really key here, the ability to respond in a really helpful way. You put so much trust into these providers, so much trust into these solutions. And for lots of consumers, it will be their only interface with their bank. Gone are the high street experiences with so many closures. So this experience really, really matters. So confidence and trust is absolutely key for the customer. They need to know that they are understood and that they're supported, and essentially that they're going to achieve a good, positive outcome that's in their interests. So there's real responsibility that comes with this. Now, when we looked at the scoreboard, here's a few of the good examples that we'll talk through in a moment. But some of the providers that we looked at had really strong LLM capabilities. Have trouble with that. Really strong language model capabilities. Others were far more capable in surfacing the data from the back end systems. So some had really good chat, some had really good access to data, some had a bit of both. Some had neither. Now, the ones which had the really good chat, some of these were really capable at understanding intent, but they couldn't always do the thing that the customer needed to do. The tech might have been limited. Perhaps they were upfront about their capabilities, and actually we scored them higher if they were aware of their limitations as opposed to giving false hope. Some of them were more triage engines, but unfortunately that meant that some of them were simply acting as a friendly FAQ. Others were really quick to display data and present options. Some were really flashy, some were clearly very marketable features, all of these things that we see in the posts and the release updates about, but they misunderstood intent. And that's where intent really comes down to it. And I know, Ollie, you're going to share some examples in a moment around the data side. But if you offer irrelevant signposting, if you misunderstand what someone's asking for, and they get it wrong, you're creating more harm than good. So there is real risk that these providers are carrying, and it can certainly lead to mistrust in your brand. Now, of course, some of the providers could neither understand what someone was asking for or present a suitable solution. So what did these providers do best? Why have we got Revolut, Bunq and Monzo shown here? So Revolut came first. Because it was absolutely excellent at detecting intent. It was careful to build understanding, and it was also offering clarification. So what we can see here is someone has put in a request saying, I paid someone, but it doesn't look right. Can you help? And rather than simply giving a response that signposts to somewhere that the person can help themselves, what they've done is they've actually immediately drawn on the personal data and validated the request. They've actually questioned the user about whether the thing which they're querying is accurate. They're saying, I'll be happy to look into this, but I don't actually see any new transfers to someone today. So this is absolutely fantastic because it validates the request before signposting and giving a resolution. Bunq, you can see in the middle here, far more of a conversational tone, as we were saying about the different brand choices around the copy and how that's being trained. It gave really clear context and really clear signposting here. Now, sometimes there'll be solutions where there's an extra tool or capability that's best set outside of here, and it does well in that case. Monzo on the right hand side here, they did really well with reframing. So one of the tasks that the research team gave to our users was to ask the chatbot to try and reframe their response in a way that was easier to understand. Some of the providers absolutely fell over at this request. They didn't understand what was being asked of them, or they kept saying the thing in the same way. Now, when you're asking someone to reframe something in a more simple way, it's probably because you're in a moment of stress or you're needing some extra support. So it's really vital that providers have got some sort of solution which they can offer in that moment. Now, one of the mistakes that we repeatedly saw across the providers was treating the requests in isolation. So when you're understanding intent, context is absolutely key. So very few were offering the clarity of understanding that we're seeing of these three examples. Very few were using personal data to validate the question. And very few had an awareness of the user's urgency. So they were slow to respond and they were slow to give reassurance. So one thing I would absolutely say is that intent is absolutely vital in these solutions. And if a business was to do one thing, if they could do absolutely one thing in this area, what would it be? And I think it would go back to the basics of communication and listen more. Remember the 2 ears, 1 mouth rule. That applies to your chatbot as much as it does to in-person communication. You've got to listen, you've got to understand intent. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Ollie next. Oh, sorry, Ben next, I think, to focus on trust and guardrails.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Gemma. I think picking up on one of your points there around people at moments of stress, I think that's why I picked trust and guardrails, I think, is probably the key differentiator. And in one sense, it's disappointing. We didn't have anyone outstanding in this, despite the fact that sort of trust and guardrails are what makes financial services what it is. But it's also a huge opportunity because it's a big differentiator. Um, so I think what I saw when we looked at this is this sort of gap between appearing trustworthy and then actually being trustworthy. And when you start to look at things like the Revolut message in particular, I really like and this is what I find weird in some ways that everybody can do this. These are not Revolut specific things that it does. These are essentially regulatory requirements that firms have, and therefore what most banks will do is they will put them in T's and C's and they'll exist somewhere where people know it and it's almost like a disclaimer for compliance. What Revolut's doing here is using a moment of emotion to bring to life the things that make it trustworthy. And I think that's where these chatbots can have a real power. And I always remember when I was at HSBC and there was used to do calls with the then CEO of First Direct who called it an emergency service. And he said if people call First Direct on the phone, you know their name. It's like they've called 999, but for their financial lives. And I think again, thinking about that experience for banks in a similar way. Is important, and there's a real opportunity to deliver that trust and safety and security. And a real differentiator as well, as I say, because you can come back to that and say, well, that's why I would do this rather than use Plaid plus ChatGPT. Um, so I think where this is going to get increasingly important, and I know this overlaps a bit with yours, Ollie, is as you start to bring more data and personalization into the service. And I think this is the thing that those that have already established a trusted relationship will suddenly see an adoption win because people will feel comfortable. And again, coming back to that point around open banking, I think the reason we haven't seen some of the adoption is the words open and banking are what we've been taught not to do for so many years. So from an CX perspective, it doesn't make sense. Now, if I'd have a chatbot experience over 3 to 6 months and I felt like I'm really secure in the things that are doing, like the examples that are on the screen here, I'm going to feel a lot more likely to open up my financial life to my bank And that's where we moved in sort of trust paradox from people trusting that their money is safe to trusting what they're getting suggested and the things that are getting told. So um, I think I mean that probably my big takeaway here would be we need to see these firms not conflating compliance with trust. And those that are thinking about how do you get an emotional response where people feel that this is a trusted service versus one that's maybe less trusted because it's using Reddit feed threads or whatever to respond, is this huge opportunity versus just thinking, oh, now there's a problem, I need to put my compliance hat on. Um, and that's again what I hope to see a big improvement on going forwards. Um, Even though the scores aren't too bad in this area, as I said before, would have been nice to see an outstanding.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess for me, so if we jump to the data and personalization one, Gemma, here we go. So I think it quite nicely ties in with both of those points, actually. For me, we'll talk about the hierarchy of chat experiences shortly, but for me, kind of to Gemma's point around language and intent understanding, if you don't understand, if the chatbot doesn't understand what the user's query is, what they're trying to achieve, then no matter how much data use and personalization you've got baked within the experience, it's completely useless because the user's there to achieve the thing. If you can't understand the thing, then how can you service anything useful in the right way? And then similarly, without understanding what the user is trying to do, how can you possibly build trust? Again, what are those scenarios onto which the user is requesting that help? And then understanding that and responding in the right way, that's how you build trust. I think the trust building exercise is an interesting point where chatbots have a leverage perhaps over a traditional kind of call center assistant because you're already in this authenticated view. You already know the customer, you know their accounts, you know their balances and things like that. And you haven't got to go through this whole process of re-authenticating the user and can secure passwords and things like that when you answer a phone call. So you have that trust kind of inherently built in, and then using that to kind of better serve the customer experience throughout the chatbot is a surefire way of outstripping that you'd see on a kind of cool version. Um, so yeah, we've spoken a bit about data use already here, and I think there's three examples here. So on the left is Bank of America, where it surfaces relevant transactions quite nicely within in a sort of rather than a chat-based experience. They're kind of using hybrid UX elements to expose things. I think the traditional user interface of a banking app is obviously a kind of table view transaction list. And people, are familiar with that. They understand that it's an easy way of scanning things from kind of UI and user experience perspective. So deploying these kind of hybrid UX elements to better serve data is an interesting way of doing things. And I think it works effectively. So Revolut in the middle, another good example there. So what's the question is that we ask these chatbots is what's one thing I could do to improve my finances? And it's drawing on that personal data in a really contextual way. So how amount the user spent in that particular day, hand off to the analytics dashboard to see what budgets are remaining, and just contextualizing that customers' experience using that data, I think is a really powerful way of adding value there. And then finally, BBVA as a similar sort of model of kind of table-based transactions, giving users most frequently surfaced or top spending being identified through that. So I think it all starts with kind of language and intent understanding. Once you understand what the user's trying to do, then you work towards building trust and establishing those foundations. And only once you've got that and once you've built that, can you start using things like data use and personalization to provide the contextual help that users need. It's all about context. And then only once you build that, can you actually start looking at task and action execution on behalf of the user. So it all kind of feeds together to the ultimate chat experience.
Thanks, Solly. Okay, so we know that there is a huge amount of chat at the moment around where conversational experiences are going, chatbots, digital assistants, concierges, and how AI is accelerating their adoption. But the framework suggests that lots of the organisations here still haven't nailed the fundamentals. Ollie, are you happy to give us a talk through this?
Yeah, absolutely. So Here we go. Yeah. So this is what we framed it as. So, we looked at these 20 different banking chatbots. We spent almost an hour with each chatbot through our research participants, testing, kicking the tires, testing what they could do, what they couldn't do, how they could respond to various questions. And we collated all that insight, thousands of conversations across the whole of the banking market, looking at some of the best banking experiences, banking chat experiences. And what we noticed is that it sort of started forming this framework, almost this hierarchy of needs. If you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs on kind of the needs of human motivation, it all foundationally underpins by this kind of, I think it's basic food and water, I think is the Maslow version. Ben's nodding, that sounds about right. And for us, and I sort of touched on it a moment ago, but it's about understanding, like interpreting what the user actually means. And you can't elevate yourself to the next layer of the hierarchy until you've achieved that foundational thing. I think this is come on my points earlier around the legacy chatbots that were relying on rule-based systems and picking up keywords throughout a conversation, even if they had like really compelling language or were using customer data a really nice way or could complete actions on behalf of the user, they were stifled and really limited by their ability to execute anything in a meaningful way, because most of the time they couldn't understand or interpret the user. And even if you got this million wide library of phrases and terminology that people might input, the way that people spell things, shorthand, Americanisms, whatever it is, kind of spelling mistakes, etc., etc. If you're not fundamentally understanding the user's request, then you cannot build upon that kind of foundational layer of the experience. So I think that's a kind of big lesson for me, is like, for us from BehindLogin, is invest in that understanding from that kind of chat experience.
And I think, Ollie, in some ways it's no different to anything, in the sense that I think we've seen a lot of firms with digital pre-AI jump straight to the top of that pyramid, which is, we think this is what people want, so we're going to give it to them and push it to them. And certainly what we've spent the last 8 years doing is helping firms complete the bottom side of that triangle, which is use life moments to understand context and intent and what people actually need and want, and then give them information to help them make better decisions. That in turn feeds personalization, because you've got more of an understanding about people, and it essentially gets you to the point of action and anticipation. And so I agree this is a hierarchy for chatbots, but it's actually just a hierarchy for designing around customers. And the firms that have done that from day one as a DNA are unsurprisingly coming the top of a chatbot thing, because that's how they think, and it's cultural rather than technological. And I think that's probably the biggest message for me on this is a cultural change. That how do you get the information to give these right answers back? And how do you build the trust of the consumer to tell you that information in the first instance, rather than they only ever come to you when they've got an action that you need to complete on their behalf?
Yep, definitely agreed. Cool. Well, I think perhaps it's a little nod towards how Life Moments and BehindLogin are working together, and then maybe we can jump into some Q&A, Gemma. But so if you think about the kind of the full spectrum of discovery to delivery, and this hierarchy of needs being a good example of that, BehindLogin are experts in kind of the research element of it, understanding and benchmarking your digital experience against the market. Obviously, you have this framework and this hierarchy of knowing what good looks like and how to achieve that. And then when it comes to the kind of execution layer, that's where we're working with Ben and the Life Moments team to actually take those kind of research insights and that auditing and that kind of understanding of the market, and then the practical application of that. So building upon this kind of, the jobs to be done, the foundations of good product design, building upon the hierarchy of chatbot needs. That's where we have a really exciting opportunity to collaborate. So I'm sure we'll have lots of good conversations after this, but yeah, just wanted to float that to everyone.
Super, thanks, Ollie. Conscious of time, we've got a few questions here. I know that Ben, you've picked up one of them so far, so we'll give that one a quick nod. We had a question around the lack of data used to drive personalization and engagement sits almost contrary to the regulation instruction that you get with regards to data minimization. So large tech providers, other organizations don't face this level of scrutiny. How do we get around it? Do you change T's and C's, ask regulators to change their stance? What are our suggestions based on this and previous work? And you gave a quick response. You happy to talk through that quickly, Ben? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a great challenge, Alex, and I think it's obviously a challenge for the industry. But again, I see this as an opportunity in disguise because I think um, it's sort of the trust layer that's implicit in financial services. And therefore, what we've got to do is earn the consumer's desire to give us the data, because actually, where they are giving their data to other firms and having bad outcomes, they will learn from that. And then they will look for where they can do that differently. And all I put in my comment was, as an example of how we've thought about designing for that, is rather than implicitly just assume you're going to use their data, where you provide a chatbot experience, have a little bit at the bottom of the chatbot that just says you can add your data into this, and essentially it's a toggle that allows your personal data, say data you put to a calculator or your bank account data, to be toggled in. And you're sort of then using the fact that you're trying to get best customer outcomes, which is consumer duty, uh, but you're also giving agency to the consumer, which I'm not saying it's a defense against data minimization, but at least it's allowing you to show that the consumer has the option of data minimization if they so require.
Super, thank you. Okay, next question. Do we feel that completion in chat rather than signposting will become hygiene capability? If yes, why? Ollie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I think even some of the biggest, most popular LLMs, struggling after you now, Gemma, still aren't enabling, this kind of in-chat completion. There's very little examples across the market of actually that kind of final execution. And I think there's still the hallucination risk. Obviously, models are getting much more intelligent, but there's still hallucination risk that we haven't really seen reliable action engines, as you might call them, within the market yet. So I think that that kind of final 10% to moving to execution in chat is still not quite there. And particularly within the financial services world, I think where you're using, where we're touching people's money, it's got a kind of significant risk attached to it. So the appetite to do that, I think, is currently outweighing the risk of doing it. Um,
I think
I,
there's
I think this
also,
is oh, sorry,
sorry,
go on,
go on,
Jim.
Ben.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's context specific, this question, because I think there's things you want to complete in a chat, but I think the big opportunity again for financial services here is for taking stuff out of chat into the wider digital experience. So if it's a big life event, for instance, you're going to want to maybe go on a browser and play around with a calculator or a simulator or something like that. So I think certainly firms need to be able to complete certain things within chat, but they need to make sure they're seamlessly getting you out to a human. They need to make sure they're seamlessly getting you out to a source of truth or a calculator or some other digital experience for the right way. And again, same as my data point, really, giving that agency back to the consumer so they can go where they want to go for the type of engagement that they want to have becomes important, rather than just we end up this world where we've all just got a chat window and that's all that exists for everything digital.
I'd absolutely agree with that. And I think within that chat window, I think the one thing I'd add is at the beginning when Ollie mentioned there were some examples such as cancelling your card that all of them can do. I think we're going to see a handful more core user experiences that are supported in app going forward, which will come the commonplace. But it certainly won't be for everything. Okay, Thomas, thank you. Great to hear from Ben. Wondering what your thoughts are on ChatGPT, including open finance and providing guidance verging on advice. Interesting about the term advice, isn't it? What will competition look like when it's the same chatbot that you ask for a recipe and a retirement projection? So I guess this goes back to the ChatGPT piece again. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's interesting.
all I'd add on that, Tamash, is that I've probably asked now 6 times in FCA conversations why, when they call out finfluencers, and now that's moved into a more progressive state, no one's been willing to call out ChatGPT. And I think that's just the world we live in. So there aren't going to be sanctions for global tech companies doing this. The question really is, how do we differentiate? I mean, personally, I find it terrifying, but I think that's where consumer behavior is. So we've got to rise to the challenge as an industry and be able to provide a credible alternative. I think the interesting point for me is whether that is an alternative that lives inside ChatGPT So like NatWest putting their mortgage tool inside ChatGPT, or whether it's via a financial institution app or experience. That's probably the battleground over the next few years. Um, but we know that there's growing research that foreseeable harm is being caused by people using these services for advice and retirement. But there isn't any mechanism to stop that happening, I don't believe. And therefore, what we've got to do is convince people that it's better to ask Standard Life, let's say.
I think also whenever you have access to more personal data, there is more risk and there's more opportunity. So, of course, you're looking at so much breadth of a user's interaction here across so many different lanes and channels. So, I think what's going to be interesting when we see competition and others emerging with similar solutions, we all get to play with the Chat GPT piece a little bit more, is how disciplined they are in separating the different lanes and ring fencing or controlling how the financial conversation is held alongside conversations around whether it's shopping, home life, political persuasion, whatever that might be. Factors which never played a part in banking journeys alongside personal data for banking previously. I think it's going to be really interesting. Okay, so next question. What can businesses outside of the banking industry take from this insight, especially if they are in the early stages of development? Ben, I was going to say this might tie back to Ben's point around the hierarchy being applied to all experiences. What do you think, Holly?
Yeah, I was going to say same thing. I think, yeah, it's all experiences and it's all industries. So the foundations of good user experience, foundations of good product design all stem from understanding the user context, understanding the user queries and requests. So I think, we sort of went into this thinking that the financial services world was a good, mature example where we'd see some kind of world-class chat experiences that the rest of the market could learn from. I think that was a hypothesis. I'm not sure. We haven't really done a huge amount of research on other industries yet to prove or disprove that. But I think there's some really interesting innovation happening. We saw that across those five criteria, whilst there were a handful of standout examples that were doing it all right, there's kind of good examples across each element of it. So I think when you look at that hierarchy of experience that we built, and you look at the individual providers that are doing things particularly well, I think outside of banking, there's certainly developments that we could learn from. So yeah, I think it's all good insight to lean into basically.
And the only thing I'd add, I think, is that in regulated industries, so with pharma or any industry where regulation typically exists for consumer harm prevention, and therefore lean into the trust opportunity that exists from regulation and rebadge it from being compliance into a way of building, of building a relationship with a customer. I don't think there's any different for other regulated industries.
Okay, thank you so much. Right, we're going to do a quick wrap here. So, thank you everyone for attending. What we've got here is a QR code. If you've not yet seen the report, please feel free to go online, download your own copy of that, and you can see these results in a little bit more detail yourself. Feel free to share that internally. If you'd like to continue the conversation with BehindLogin or Live Moments, you've got our details here. You can contact all of us, find us easily on LinkedIn, or you can ping us a message if you'd like any introductions. We would love to continue the conversation. At BehindLogin, we do lots of work. I know we're working with some of you on custom research and your own benchmarks to see how your experiences compare to others in your space. So if that sounds interesting, then we're here for the conversation. So yeah, please do reach out. If there's anything that you're considering as part of your chatbot strategy or your experience design, then we'd love to help. And yeah, we'd love to hear any feedback. Thank you for joining, and we'll speak soon. Thank you, Ollie. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.